now available in paperback and e-readers. Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess featuring a bonus pin-up and the other two books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online bookstores everywhere today. One of my viewers from Boston wanted to know how ghetto hood culture got popularized. Well, your ghetto hood culture was popularized by those who controlled the mainstream media back in the early 1970s. Now, before the early 1970s, black men controlled the image of black people in magazines like Ebony and Jet. And the late John H. Johnston, because he was one of the people who controlled the media at the time, he made sure that the images of black men and black women in his publications like Ebony, Jet, Hue, and Tan oftentimes presented a positive image of black people. And most black people wanted to present a positive image of themselves because we wanted to show many of the racists out here that we were human beings. So you had a lot of people who realized the importance of presenting that positive image because they were bombarded with numerous negative media images such as the Amos and Andy show, the Beulah show, and numerous minstrel caricatures from the days of Jim Crow all the way up until the 1970s. Now, most black people had a strong black family, and there was a father in the home. And the father established a standard for the way his family carried and conducted itself, and that's why we saw a lot of black people looking their best. That's why we saw the father dressed in a suit. We saw the mother wearing a nice dress, and the children looking polished and clean, because the family wanted to present an image to the world that black people deserved respect, and they wanted to show themselves as respectable. And this was the image of black people that went on until about the early 1970s, when we started to see your Melvin Van Peebles first come out with the film Sweet Sweetback Song, which was the first independent film produced by a black man. Now, seeing the success of Sweet Sweetback Song, your Hollywood, which was struggling at the time, decided to go out here and create films to target black audiences. Now, Hollywood had no interest in targeting black audiences with media for years because it was making a lot of money on the silent generation and the generation before that, who consumed lots of their products, such as musicals, such as epic movies, and such as these films based on classic literature. They had been making lots of money on these kinds of films, which featured predominantly white audiences, but in the late 1960s, with the Vietnam War, the baby boomer generation was not interested in that kind of media. And because the baby boomer generation was not interested in watching epic movies, movies about World War II, or movies about classic literature, and these epic movies, many of those youngsters were not going to the movies anymore, and as a result, the studios were struggling to make profits. And because the studios were struggling to make profits, they decided to start producing movies to appeal to predominantly black audiences. And when they were producing this media, they decided to do it in a very passive-aggressive way. Yes, your Hollywood did go out here and start making black films. However, they would aggressively promote stereotypes about black people. And because they promoted stereotypes about black people, they went out here and promoted films that showed the so-called ghetto life, and these films oftentimes presented us with a very slanted image of the black community. So even though during the 1960s and 1970s, there were a lot of middle class black families where the father was in the home and the father was working and the mother was working as well, because in most black two-parent households, both parents had to work due to low wages. In some cases, you had the mainstream media pushing a narrative that showed that black men were lazy, black men did not take care of their families, and black men were not good leaders. And this was done by design because many in the mainstream media wanted to demonize the image of the black man, and they wanted to say, oh, most black people lived in a ghetto, because while they wanted to make money on those black audiences, they did not want to alienate their white customer base. And that's how we started to plant the seeds of so-called ghetto culture, because the mainstream media wanted to present us with this image of a lazy and incompetent black man who had to go out here and sell drugs, this black man who was a pimp, this black man who was a hustler. But this really was not the case at all with many black people. No, at the time, there were a lot of black men working in civil service jobs, a lot of black men working in the post office, a lot of black men working in factories, and many of those men, they were providing for their families, but the mainstream media did not want to focus on those black men because they were all about promoting white supremacy and anti-black racism. And because they wanted to promote anti-black racism in their media, they going out of their way to show us a black man in a negative light, and that's how we got all of these pimps and hustlers. And because a lot of young kids were desperate to see a black image on film or television, they went out here and ran to the movie theaters to go see these kinds of images of pimps, these images of hustlers, these images of irresponsible baby daddies. And this promoted the idea in people's minds that this was actual black culture, but this was never black culture at all. No, black culture was always about excellence, and it was always about maintaining a very high standard. But your people who control the media arm of white supremacy wanted to lower the standard as related to black people because, one, they did not want to see images of black excellence, and two, they did not want to compete against heterosexual black men. So they went out of their way to demonize the image of black people, and they wanted to popularize the image of the ghetto as the standard for black people, because even though a lot of black people lived in what they called so-called ghettos, that was because racists would not allow black people to own homes in certain areas. Now, this is chronicled in Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, and a lot of people want to say, oh, there's a ghetto hood culture, but that ghetto hood culture never was a part of black life. People were forced to live in certain neighborhoods that due to segregation, and even though black people lived in those neighborhoods due to segregation, a lot of black people had a high standard for themselves. And that's something that the mainstream media didn't want to talk about, because that standard would show that even in these rundown tenements, black people still strived for excellence. And they didn't also want to talk about other black neighborhoods like your Sandy, there's a place in Staten Island called Sandy Beach. It was a known black community of suburban homes, but the mainstream media didn't want to talk about that type of area because it didn't fit the narrative they wanted to push and promote regarding black people. No, they only wanted to push the ghetto because they wanted to program an idea in black people's minds about the ghetto being the so-called reality, but that ghetto was never an actual reality for black people. No, that was a social construct created by your Madison Avenue and Hollywood for black people to follow, along with the narrative that the black man was not caring or providing for his family, and he was a deadbeat and a loser. And really, that was your white racist projecting onto the black man, because at the time, before the feminist movement, the black family was intact, and in fact, there were more black marriages than actual white marriages. And during the Great Depression, you saw actually more white men leaving their families, but your black man was staying at the side of his woman and looking to try to build with his woman. This is stuff that they didn't want to put out here in the mainstream media as a norm. What they wanted to push in the mainstream media as a norm was the idea that the black man was incapable of caring for his family, and in some cases didn't care about his family. And they wanted to push the idea that the black man was some sort of whoremonger, again, pushing narratives to demonize the black man. And that's how we got the seeds of the ghetto, so-called ghetto culture that we see today. It all started in the early 1970s because most of these mainstream companies, yes, passively they wanted to put out media with black people, but aggressively they wanted to go out here and promote stereotypes about black people, similar to the old caricatures of your antebellum South and Jim Crow, such as the Brute, such as the Mammy, such as the Sapphire, and in many cases they repackaged these old stereotypes because they wanted to make white racists feel comfortable about the image of black people, and they didn't want to have black people seeing images and stories that would inspire and empower them. That's something they did not want to push on their media platforms. Now, as time went on, we saw these stereotypes evolve in things like blaxploitation movies, and we also started to see it evolve in the 90s with so-called hood movies. Now, there were people out here looking to push back against these stereotypes, like your John Amos tried to do on the show Good Times. He and Esther Roll oftentimes pushed back as related to the stereotypes that they were trying to push on that show, which was breathing brand new life into the whole stereotype of a black family living in the projects, even though the only way you could get into the projects is if you were, one, on welfare, and two, the father could not be in the home. So they were pushing a stereotype and contradicting themselves at the same time because, again, many black families lived a middle class lifestyle, and many black families, they were out here working, and they didn't want to push the narrative that the black man was out here working at these jobs, at the plants, at these jobs, at different companies, or even at their own businesses. No, they wanted to push the narrative that the black man was lazy, the black man didn't care about his family, and they wanted to push the narrative that the black woman had to be a single mom. And in some cases, like in the movie Claudine, she was a promiscuous woman who had kids by multiple different fathers. Again, it was white folks projecting their own ideas onto black people and projecting their dysfunction onto black people and trying to say that this was black life. But the sad part is that many black people imbibed this media and did not have anyone to give them any sort of information to learn about themselves. And because many people were desperate for their own image, they bought into this whole idea of a ghetto, even though many black people never wanted a ghetto before them. But because Madison Avenue and Hollywood dressed up the whole idea of ghetto as a social norm, many black people bought into this idea. Now, there were black people, again, out here trying to push back against these narratives, and people like Bill Cosby did manage to start trying to change the frame of thinking. And this is something Bill Cosby, I really respect him for, is coming out here and refuting those narratives with shows like The Cosby Show. And that really changed the perspective of a lot of young black boys and girls like myself who grew up with that show. And it showed us that there were regular black folks who were working good jobs and striving for the excellence our grandparents and great grandparents oftentimes aspired to and wanted us to continue pushing towards. And during the 80s, we did get to see those, we started to see a push away from the ghetto, but we started to see Hollywood trying to take black people back into the ghetto culture. First, with the music, with the NWA and their Straight Out of Compton, and with John Singleton's Boys in the Hood, a film that is completely misinterpreted because the mainstream media only wanted to push the idea of the ghetto and the hood, but it did not want to push the story about how a father had an impact on his son's life and how a father kept his son from becoming a statistic of violence. So the mainstream media constantly goes out of its way to push these narratives of the ghetto and poverty, and that's what they did in the 90s. And once Boys in the Hood came along and they totally misinterpreted that film, they started to push the hood culture as the mainstream. And as time has gone on, and we've gone from your hood movies to your Tyler Perry movies, we have seen a complete decline in black culture, and ghetto culture has taken over again as the main culture in your white media. And this is why it's important to not imbibe mainstream media, because mainstream media is detrimental to the black mind. Because if you imbibe too much of this mainstream culture featuring all of these ghetto thugs, these hood rats, and all of these baby mamas and all of this culture, it'll start making you believe that ghetto is quote unquote black, but ghetto has nothing to do with black culture. No, ghetto culture is something that white racists made up, and they made this culture up because they don't want to see black excellence, because seeing black excellence makes your white racists uncomfortable. And they become uncomfortable because they know that they can't have their system of white supremacy where they're having all of these giveaways, givebacks, and freebies if they have to actually step up and compete. Because in a world where they actually have to step up and compete against black people, that's something that terrifies them because they cannot go and be on top. And that's why you see so many whites getting angry these days, because they want to live that quote-unquote white lifestyle that Madison Avenue and Hollywood have for them. But when they start to see black excellence, this really terrifies them, because seeing black excellence lets them know that they're not going to be able to live comfortably at the expense of black people and off black labor. And that's the thing that scares them when they start seeing black images of black people like I produce on the SJS Direct Imprint in some cases. Because when you start seeing images of black CEOs, black college graduates, and black people living different lifestyles like the black goth subculture, this terrifies many of your racists, because your racists, they want the world to be white, and they want only positive images of white people, and they don't want you to see a rich, diverse world of black people, something that has been kept away from many black people who have never seen the complete world of black culture, because the mainstream media only wants to keep you in a ghetto, and they want to keep your mind in a ghetto and keep your mind in a frame of thinking that you can't be a success. Everything in the hood is going to destroy you, and you should not aspire for anything. This is all about programming an idea in your mind that the only thing for a black person is failure and poverty. And this is also reinforced by your public school education, where many of the books oftentimes present you with failure. I mean, this is something I came to a conclusion at about in the 2013 or 2014, and I talked to one of my family members about it while we were waiting for a bus. And I sat there and I said, all of the literature in your public schools oftentimes shows you the black man or the black woman dying or never achieving any success. And again, this is white supremacy trying to program an idea in your mind that there is nothing but failure for you. And that's why they go out here of their way to perpetuate and promote this ghetto hood culture and popularize it. But the truth is that that's not who we are, and that's not what our culture is. And we need to start thinking about what our culture is, because our culture is much larger than this. And that's one of the things I try to do on the SJS Direct Imprint, is show people how much larger and how much broader black culture is, because black culture is not the ghetto. No, black culture is bigger than the ghetto, but you have to open your eyes and open your mind to see how much bigger the black world is, and to become a part of a larger world of excellence and start striving for the excellence our grandparents and great-grandparents wanted for themselves and what they want us to aspire to be. Now, I hope this answers the question of my viewer who requested this video. And if you want to request a video, you can send me a donation through the Cash App or the PayPal by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to see a more positive image of black people in media, you can pick up some of the books on the SJS Direct Imprint, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, and other novels I've produced, like A Recipe for Success and The Thetas. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Blast from the Past. Hell's aspiring angel takes on her demonic doppelganger in this action-packed, time-traveling E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Blast from the Past with a bonus E-Steam comic book, No Good Deed, in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere.